we have to be very, very careful. What we're talking is not so much democracy, we're talking organised hypocrisy. Hard facts.
The nighthawk flies and the owl cries as we're driving down the road.
The song you were just listening to was written and performed by the great Irish folk singer Christy Moore in tribute to Salvador Allende, Chile's democratically elected socialist president who was overthrown and died in the course of the military coup that was led by General Augusto Pinochet on September 11th, 1973. And this is the 9/11 anniversary, which hardly makes the news at this time of year, dwarfed obviously by its more recent counterpart, the terrorist attack unleashed against the United States in 2001. However, the significance of the fascist coup that took place in Chile in 1973 cannot be overstated, as here ensued the world's first experiment in that mass experiment in human despair, more commonly known as neoliberalism. This is an economic system and doctrine so extreme and barbaric it requires a major economic and/or social convulsion, in other words a shock, to enable it to be applied with the minimum of resistance, and thus we have the coup in Chile in 1973. Now, Salvador Allende was a Marxist intellectual and physician, and he was elected president of Chile in 1970. And in his maiden speech to the nation's parliament, he said, and I quote, "This is an unprecedented time which offers us the material means of realising the most generous utopian dreams of the past. The only thing that prevents our achieving this is the heritage of greed, of fear, and of obsolete institutional traditions. Between our time and that of the liberation of man on a planetary scale, this inheritance has to be overcome. And only in this way will it be possible to call upon men to reconstruct their lives, not as products of a past of slavery and exploitation, but in the most conscious realisation of their noblest potentialities. This is the socialist ideal." End quote. However, just as the Cuban people have experienced in their history, and as the people of Venezuela are experiencing now, there is nothing more powerful than the wrath of Washington-backed economic interests and oligarchs wherever and whenever socialist governments dare emerge in Latin America to challenge their right to rule. In 1970, the US president was one Richard Nixon, who in response to Allende's election promised to, and I quote, "make the economy scream," instructing the CIA to start working to undermine the country in order to pave the way for Pinochet's military takeover. And at the time, US business interests in Chile were extensive, especially in the copper mining industry, in which two US corporations, Anaconda and Kennecott, were major players. Nixon's Secretary of State during this period was Henry Kissinger, a man who needs no introduction and with enough blood on his hands to have a river named after it. Of Allende's election in Chile in 1970, Kissinger said, and I quote, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." End quote. Now just ponder that for a second. I'm going to repeat it. Kissinger said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch our country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." Moving on, in his farewell address broadcast to the nation and the world over the radio as the military assault against the presidential palace was underway, Allende said, "In this definitive moment, the last thing which I can say to you is that I hope you will learn this lesson. Foreign capital, imperialism united with reaction created the climate for the armed forces to break with their tradition. These are my last words. I am sure that my sacrifice will not be in vain. I am sure that it will be at least a moral lesson which will punish felony, cowardice and treason." I'm John White, and this is Hard Facts. Now, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is a friend of this show. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. He is a historian, writer and political analyst. Marcus, welcome back to the show.
Hello, John. It's an absolute pleasure to be back on your excellent show. So thank you very much for having invited me back on.
Thank you. The impact of the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in 1973, I don't think can be overstated. I mean, I gave a brief outline in my introduction. We're talking an unbroken thread from then until now, Marcus. We're talking about the structural adjustment programs, the neoliberal structural adjustment programs that were implemented in the United States by Ronald Reagan, in the UK by Margaret Thatcher. We're talking about the draconian economic reforms that were introduced in Russia upon the demise of the Soviet Union by Boris Yeltsin, when billions worth of Russian wealth was transported out of the country. It was expropriated by home-based oligarchs. We're also talking, Marcus, by the destruction of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Give me your understanding, Marcus, of this, what I consider to be monster, otherwise known as neoliberalism.
Yes, well, Chile is just one example, though, of course, a brutal example, literally speaking and metaphorically speaking, which demonstrates the true face of American foreign policy and, of course, of the American economic system. And it shows that any argument put out by an American politician or an American journalist, backed up by British politicians and British journalists, that America is truly and genuinely committed to the rule of law and freedom and international law, is simply untenable. What happened in Chile really should be known far more than what it actually is. I mean, how many people in Britain are aware that a democratically elected president, let me just repeat that, a democratically elected president was overthrown in an American coup? And why was he overthrown in an American-backed coup? Because Washington did not like his politics. Now, that's beyond shameful. That is absolute depravity. And Chile.
And by the way, Marcus, they would actually refer to it as democracy. That's what they would refer it to, Washington. That's their understanding of what democracy is and should be. The right to roam around the world, as Kissinger infamously said, and sort out all these countries. A very paternalistic view. This is imperialism. This is empire, isn't it?
Well, there's a discussion, isn't there? Is America, or are American policymakers genuinely committed to democracy, or are they genuinely committed to putting America first beyond any other country in the world and achieving power for America by any means? Now, I personally believe it's the latter. I think the Americans understand what democracy is. I think most people in the world understand what democracy is. But I think the Americans live in the world of realpolitik, and they know that in order for America to reign supreme globally, then they have to carry out acts which contravene the whole concept of democracy, of human rights, of the rule of law. And the Americans are happy to do that. Now, I despise the American government. I despise their methods. But you have to give them respect in that they live in the world of realpolitik and they don't care what they do. So how do you counter that? You have to have a strong country in the world, another superpower, which will block them or limit them. And of course, during the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. In today's world, it is Russia, though, of course, Russia still has a long way to go until it regains its Soviet-era strength. But you're not going to change the Americans. You're not going to change the mindset of people on Capitol Hill. The only way you have a real effect on them is to have another superpower which checks them in certain parts of the world.
Marcus, what you just said there was very cogent, because it is indisputable, isn't it, that the longest and most sustained period of peace in modern history was when the Soviet Union was extinct. Now, that's not because America was suddenly a benign power in those days. Of course it wasn't. It was still the same snarling beast that aspired to global hegemony. Look at the carnage that has ensued, the wreckage post-Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The breakup and destruction of Yugoslavia, which I mentioned, the destruction of Afghanistan for the second time, the first time being in the 1980s when the Soviet Union was approaching its end, the destruction of Iraq, Libya, and obviously the US role in the conflict in Syria, trying to destabilise a secular, multicultural, multi-religious country in the face of what can only be described as a latter-day Khmer Rouge. So the evidence is overwhelming, but at the root of this American system, as you know, is economics, is the reach for global hegemony of markets and resources. And I think it was George Kennan, the US State Department Mandarin, who came up with the policy of containment vis-a-vis the Soviet Union after the Second World War. He came up with a famous quote. It was in the context of a classified, since declassified, internal State Department memo where he removed the veil from the eyes of any of his colleagues who purported to believe that America's mission was to spread democracy and human rights, talking about the fact that we are only 6% of the world's population but control 50% of the world's resources, and our objective is to maintain this disparity. And this is where we get to neoliberalism, because this is an economic system. It's a violent economic system. It's no respecter of borders, no respecter of national sovereignty, no respecter of cultural identity. And so this is why it's so relevant, Marcus, that we're having this discussion with regards to Salvador Allende. Just give us an outline, if you will, of the damage that neoliberalism did to Russia and the Russian people in the 1990s.
Well, I mean, first of all, neoliberalism was given even greater prominence, even greater influence during the 1980s as a result of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And that's very, very important because the capitalist system up until then was still, in my opinion, largely speaking, immoral. But what came out in the 1980s as a result of Thatcherism and as a result of the economic policies of Ronald Reagan really laid the foundation for what we have today in the world. And you make a reference to what happened to Russia in the 1990s. Well, if people understood the abject pain and suffering that the ordinary Russian experienced from 1992 onwards, throughout the whole decade of the 1990s, as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism, then they would understand where Vladimir Putin has come from. Because 1992 is when Boris Yeltsin instructed his economics minister, Gaidar, who was a brilliant mathematician, but knew nothing about running an economy. And of course, Gaidar, he introduced what's known as shock therapy.
Now, sorry, Marcus, I'm sorry, we'll have to stop there for a quick break, but we're going to get into shock therapy right after this. Don't go anywhere.
Hard Facts.
Welcome back to the second half of Hard Facts. I'm sitting in the company of Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine, and we are discussing the anniversary of the lesser known 9/11 event, which was the coup that overthrew the socialist government, the democratically elected socialist government led by Salvador Allende, which led not only to his death but the deaths of upwards of 40,000 people who were tortured and executed in the aftermath. Marcus, sorry, I had to interrupt you there for the break, but you were just outlining very eloquently the damage that was wreaked with regard to Russia on the back of the demise of the Soviet Union and ensuing introduction of free market reforms, otherwise known as neoliberalism. So continue, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Or shock therapy. The economics minister, Gaidar, he introduced shock therapy, whereby almost overnight, Russian national industries, Russian national resources, they were privatized. They were then sold off to oligarchs who had emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union, who had attained positions of power, and they took the wealth for themselves. Everything that the Russian people, the Soviet people had toiled for 70 years just disappeared. And because of this shock therapy, because of this neoliberalism that was introduced at the behest of Yeltsin, but also at the behest of America and, of course, the IMF, the Russian people went from living in a secure, stable society to a society that I guess we could call was
Darwinian. It was Darwinian, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It became like a pauper state. And of course, it was a matter of survival. And many, many Russians died as a result of that. Millions of them went into abject poverty. You know, during Soviet times, they had security and stability. Everyone had a job. Everyone had a salary. Everyone had a house or a flat. Everyone had a pension. That was lost overnight because of those neoliberal reforms. And who benefited? Well, it wasn't the Russian people. It was a tiny minority of Russian businessmen, people like Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, who, like Gaidar, were brilliant mathematicians, absolutely phenomenal mathematicians, and they saw an opportunity to make billions, and they made billions. But the ordinary Russian person was plunged into abject poverty, abject pain and suffering. The other people who benefited, of course, was the Americans and the IMF. And it's no exaggeration to say that to a very large extent, Russia during the 1990s was a slave to America, was a slave to the IMF. Yeltsin, willingly implemented these policies and reforms. But at the same time, he was given his orders by the Americans. And if he ever tried to challenge the Americans because he sensed that Russian nationalists or the Russian military or the Russian intelligence services were starting to feel very, very aggrieved, then the Americans would simply remind Yeltsin of who helped to re-elect him in that 1996 presidential election and who can withhold IMF loans. And I'll make this point very, very quickly, John. That 1996 election in Russia, we're starting to hear about it again this year, because people were saying, well, if Russia interfered in the American presidential election last year, the Americans did it in 1996 in Russia. That is absolutely true. But the Communist Party or the Communist Party leader actually won that presidential election.
Yes.
But through electoral fraud, the victory was given to Boris Yeltsin. But in reality, the communist leader, he actually won that presidential election. No way did Boris Yeltsin win it. Going into that election, Boris Yeltsin's approval ratings were 1%, 2%, 3%.
Now, Marcus, yeah, absolutely. Now, Marcus, obviously going back to Chile, where this all started, this train of neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism was established by Milton Friedman, who still today is considered an economic genius by right-wing ideologues. He was championed and lionised by Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and a whole host of right-wing leaders in his time. He died in 2006, and he was called upon to be Pinochet's economic advisor after the coup. Now, Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize, and Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan journalist and writer, said, and I quote, "He got the Nobel Prize, we got Pinochet." And Pinochet's barbarity cannot really be exaggerated, and yet he was defended by Margaret Thatcher right to the end. I mean, he was placed under house arrest in the UK under a Spanish arrest warrant, famously in the late 1990s, and she went to bat for him. She gave a speech in the House of Lords defending Pinochet, saying he was a champion of democracy, having overthrown a democratically elected president. And this is where the mask is removed from the likes of Thatcher and Reagan and Yeltsin and all the rest of them, because this is a monstrous economic system, and no greater champion of that system and of the political chaos that has ensued and continues to ensue on the back of it is there than Dr. Henry Kissinger. Now, Dr. Kissinger is still alive. Amazingly, he's in his 90s. He still plays an active role in politics. But no one should ever forget that Hillary Clinton bragged during a debate in the primary process in 2016 against her Democratic Party rival Bernie Sanders that if she was elected, or Bernie Sanders brought up the fact that she'd written a book in which she'd said that if she was elected president, she would call upon the advice of Henry Kissinger when it came to foreign policy. Now, this is a man responsible who helped to effect the genocide in Cambodia in the 1970s under the Khmer Rouge, the genocide in East Timor under the Indonesian military junta, events in Chile, of course, and also Vietnam. Give me quickly, if you will, because we're running out of time, your understanding of Kissinger, because I know that you've done a lot of work in regard to Kissinger's legacy yourself.
Well, Henry Kissinger is a man of great intellect and a man of great wickedness. And he was the architect of American intervention in all those countries that you just cited. But one country which isn't on the radar of many people and which bears the malignant hand of Henry Kissinger is, of course, Cyprus, because Turkey had long had territorial imperial designs on Cyprus. And Henry Kissinger valued immensely America's strategic relationship with Turkey, because through Turkey, America had great influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, on the border of the Soviet Union, and in the Middle East. And Henry Kissinger in 1974 became aware that Turkey had plans to invade Cyprus and to partition the island. And because he valued Turkey so much, he gave the green light to Turkey to invade Cyprus. And they did that in July 1974. They invaded an independent sovereign country. They partitioned Cyprus. They ethnically cleansed 200,000 Greek Cypriots from the north of the island. More than 1,000 Greek Cypriots are to this day still missing. They're dead, we can say that for certain. They were taken to Turkey and executed there. And of course, Greek Cypriot heritage in the north of Cyprus, which is now illegally occupied by 50,000 Turkish soldiers, has been destroyed. The Turks have destroyed virtually all the churches, all the monasteries, all the Orthodox cemeteries and other Christian cemeteries in the north. And that is down to Henry Kissinger. And I just wish that more and more people would understand that Cyprus, like Chile, like Vietnam, like Syria, is also a victim of American imperialism and a victim of Dr. Henry Kissinger.
So what you've just outlined are the actions of a war criminal, aren't they? Marcus?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And if there was any justice in this world, he would be in a court charged with a whole array of criminal charges. And one of them would be complicit in ethnic cleansing. And of course, in the case of Chile, with the execution of an elected leader.
Now, many people listening to this may make the mistake of thinking that we're talking about an event that belongs to history, and it doesn't, because the past, as we know, absolutely informs the present. And what happened in Chile, we're seeing a replay of that, aren't we, Marcus, in Venezuela as we speak, where the socialist government of the Bolivarian socialist government of Maduro is under assault and being depicted as a violator of human rights, as a violator of democracy, when in fact the very opposite is the case. He is trying to defend democracy in Venezuela, and he's trying to carry on the legacy of the great Hugo Chavez. And the difference is, Marcus, it seems to me, is strip away the obfuscation and the embroidery that's allowed to descend when we talk about politics and economics. You can either rule in the interests of the minority who control a country's wealth and resources, or you can rule in the interests of the majority, the workers who create that wealth. Now, the stakes could not be higher when it comes to Venezuela. Give me your prognosis of Venezuela, because I have to tell you, as we speak, I'm very worried about the future in Venezuela, given the forces that are arrayed against it, which are, of course, backed by Washington.
Well, it was about 10 years ago when most of Latin America, with the notable exception of Colombia, had rejected American imperialism, had rejected political parties which were pro-American. And for the first time, South America or Latin America was no longer America's backyard. Now, fast forward 10 years, and of course we can say the empire has struck back in Latin America. We see that in Brazil. And you're absolutely correct to feel alarmed, John, by what is happening in Venezuela, because I believe that the Americans understand that their ultimate objective in Syria has failed. The ultimate objective to overthrow the Syrian government, President Assad, has failed. I think they are looking now for revenge, and I think they are looking at Venezuela. And of course, we have President Trump, who is vehemently anti the socialist governments in Latin America. And he's made it very clear that he will not tolerate them in America's backyard. Now, President Maduro of Venezuela is doing a number of things, but one of the things he's doing is maintaining Venezuelan independence, and also he's ensuring that Venezuela's national industries and its natural resources, in particular oil, remain in the hands of the Venezuelans and not the Americans, not American cartels, not American corporations. The key for President Maduro will be, however, outside assistance. The Syrian government is going to survive and is going to eventually win this conflict. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons, but key to its survival has been Russian military intervention. If Venezuela is to survive, if it is to keep back American hands, then really Russia is going to have to come to its aid. Now, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia doesn't have the clout of the Soviet Union. Russia has to prioritize. But I think the signs so far from the Kremlin regarding Venezuela are positive. And Russia and Venezuela have formed very close relations, very close economic relations, very close military relations. But I'm sorry to say this, that Venezuela on its own, President Maduro on his own, is simply not strong enough to repel the Americans. Cuba survived. Why? Because the Soviet Union intervened.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. We really need a balance of power in this world, Marcus, and that's what the demise of the Soviet Union proves beyond doubt. And we need to end this era of regime change, which underpins US imperialism and has been the source of all the disasters that have ensued since the demise of the Soviet Union. You've been listening to Marcus Papadopoulos. I'm John White. Until next time, remember, the only facts worth taking seriously are hard facts.